Well, thank you so much for being here. And Acadia Rower, thank you so much. I think that was the most creative and fun introduction ever. Introductions can be very boring, so I love that idea that she had. And I really want to thank Dean Skip Rutherford and Nikolai DePippa not only for inviting me to the Clinton School for this great honor, but also for an unexpected find that I made in your beautiful state yesterday. I traveled with some of my oldest journalist friends to the Crystal Bridges Museum, where I was awestruck to find one of the most historically important water paintings from my small part of the world hanging in Bentonville. I came to you from the part of Florida where George DeForest Brush painted the Indian and the Lily in 1887, and I'll begin tonight with what's happening with water in this same region of the country so that you can see how a journalist from one of the wettest states would come to write about water scarcity. Can everyone see can you guys see the, you sort of see? Frank and Amy, can you guys see? Okay, all right. So as you heard, my first book, Mirage, tells the strange story of vanishing water in the second wettest state. When Florida became a state in 1845, it was half submerged. So the Cliff's Notes for Mirage are that we set out to get rid of water and we got rid of too much. And that's really the story of water in the eastern half of the United States and somewhat the story in the middle too. In the 19th century, we perfected the art of draining swampland. In the 20th century, we became really good at pumping groundwater up from the Floridan aquifer. The Floridan is this enormous aquifer, one of the most prodigious sources of groundwater in the world, flowing under most of Florida, southern Georgia, and bits of South Carolina, Alabama, and Mississippi. It also feeds more than 900 springs, the largest concentration of freshwater springs anywhere in the world. So these springs show up in National Geographic. They were the set of the old Tarzan movies. William Bartram, when he walked through the same region in the 18th century, described them as looking like blue ether of another world. But if you haven't seen them, you should come visit. Not only have they lost what Bartram described as their amazing ebullition, but some of them are vanishing. This was White Springs, a former spa and resort, and one of Florida's largest springs, known as a first magnitude. It began to run dry in the early 70s due to groundwater pumping, and it flowed for the last time in the 90s. Other springs also have turned to weeds or rarely flow anymore. And by the way, these photos are by my talented nature photographer friend, John Moran. I always thought this shot of Peacock Springs perfectly captured Bartram's blue ether. But look at it today. Peacock has turned to an algal brown soup. This summer, I had a particularly disheartening assignment. I had to give the dedication speech for a historic marker to a lost spring, a dead spring called Kissingen. So I hiked through the dry spring bed with these elderly people who had done cannonballs into the water in their youth. That was a very, very sad, very poignant to listen to their memories of what that was like. So some of that decline is drought, but water managers connect the spring's failure to return following drought to the overpumping of groundwater. Simply too many straws in the aquifer, sucking too much, from mining to agriculture to utility withdrawals for our homes and businesses. The point is that even the most water-rich parts of the United States, even Springs regions, are coming to face water scarcity. And unfortunately, Florida has followed a well-worn path. America, too, was blessed with astonishing water wealth compared with other compared with other continents. 3.5 million miles of rivers running across the country, another 60,000 trillion gallons of groundwater stored beneath our feet in aquifers. Even Las Vegas was known for its big springs, the very amenity that brought Native Americans to the Las Vegas Valley, and then pioneers in the first place dried up in 1962. Today, freshwater habitats have become the single most degraded of all America's ecosystems. And more than any other threat are harnessing water for human use, flood control, power production, agricultural irrigation, and water for our homes and businesses is largely to blame. And this is as true of for the great waterways of the eastern United States as it is for the West. The most widespread human-caused extinction in North America was a freshwater event. That was the loss of freshwater mussels in the southern states, most notably those drowned in Muscle Shoals, Alabama, by the damming of the Tennessee River. So the last time American citizens got truly involved in water, really engaged in water, it was the early 1970s, right? This was the era when we began to move away from that age of big dams. We began to move toward a more ethical water age. We passed the Clean Water Act and created all sorts of environmental safeguards at national and state levels. But nearly 40 years into the restoration age, we still really haven't been able to alter our water fortunes. And I think it's because we haven't been able to wean ourselves from something that may be just as damaging as the dams, and that is our illusion of water abundance. Despite evidence to the contrary, from drought-racked Texas to the shrinking Colorado River, Americans still view water as an endless resource. We still flush toilets with potable water that has been treated at our great expense to meet federal drinking water standards. We still pour large amounts of this same water onto our lawns. In fact, the lawn is America's largest crop. NASA scientists using satellite imagery have found the nation covered with 63,240 square miles of turf grass, which is an area larger than most American states. In Blue Revolution, I call this our 51st state. So, of course, the illusion of water abundance is by no means a uniquely American trait. Throughout modern history, humans have flaunted water as a symbol of power, wealth, and control of nature, particularly, it seems, in places where there was not nearly enough water to control. In 17th century France, Louis XIV built some of the greatest water features in the world at the gardens of Versailles along both sides of the mile-long Grand Canal. And these sumptuous gardens were home to 1,400 water splendors when Versailles was the seat of French political power. The colossal fountains, pools, grottos, and waterfalls were positioned so that the king and his visitors would never lose sight of water during exhaustive garden tours that lasted from morning until night. But here's what the royal visitors did not know. There actually was not enough water at Versailles to keep all these fountain jets soaring, pools overflowing, and waterfalls cascading. They were built in careful groups so that they could be turned on and off according to the king's progress around the gardens. A secret palace staff would scurry ahead of the king's touring parties, signaling his whereabouts with an elaborate system of flags and whistle blasts to convey when it was safe to shut down one group of fountains and turn the next one on. So, like Versailles, the American illusion of water abundance is also carefully maintained. For the past 100 years, the water sector and large water users have gotten so good at harnessing water and moving it all around cities and regions, and in the West, of course, even moving it up and down mountains, that the average American, just like those visitors to Versailles, has never had to worry about how it all worked. The conveyance of clean water into our cities and the movement of wastewater out was among the greatest achievements of the 20th century, one that saved countless lives. But now that great achievement has grown into an entitlement. So the water sector almost did its job too well. Water flows from our taps like magic. We enjoy an endless and cheap supply of clean water, and of course we are more than happy to be absolved of the realities of wastewater. But the resulting ethos has helped lead to insufficient supplies, enormous energy consumption to move water around, financially unstable utilities, and other problems. And I don't want to dwell on problems because I want to get to the ethic. But I just want to go over a few expressions of how unsustainable U.S. water use remains in the 21st century. The Colorado River is impossibly more than 100% allocated through legal agreements among 7 U.S. states and Mexico. There is no longer enough for all human legal users, as you know, much less fish and wildlife during times of drought. Climate scientists tell us that America's largest and most iconic reservoir, Lake Mead, has a 50-50 chance of drying up by 2021. By 2017, they say there's an equally good chance that water levels in the reservoir will drop so low that Hoover Dam will be incapable of producing hydroelectric power. And those statistics are so amazing, and that's what I mean by the illusion of water abundance. Think about the millions of people who go to Hoover Dam every year for vacation to look at that marvel, and they look down into Lake Mead and they see the bathtub rings, but I think most people have no idea that we are actually in danger of our most iconic reservoir dropping below the level of the lowest intake pipe. Water wars used to be unique to the arid West. This is Lake Lanier in Atlanta. As you know, they have moved now to the eastern half of the United States. As just one example, Florida, Georgia, and Alabama have been fighting over the Chattahoochee River for more than 20 years. And for my new book, I always wanted to do this. I made a public records request for the legal fees spent by taxpayers in that battle. And in just the past decade, it added up to well over $30 million, money that has gone to the lawyers without one drop of new water for the Chattahoochee River, without one drop of new water for people or wildlife or the river. In the Midwest, parts of the massive High Plains aquifer that irrigates an entire fifth of the country's agricultural harvest is being depleted to extinction in some areas. Some agricultural interests there are quite honest about their strategy to use as much as they can while they can. Here in Arkansas, of course, the best known example is the irrigation that helped drop the alluvial aquifer 90 feet in a century. And I don't have a crystal ball, only, as I mentioned, the study of American water history. But if the past is any guide, it indicates that the current solutions to this problem, mega engineering projects that include diversions of the White River, are likely to bring unintended consequences to future generations and ecosystems. If there's one recurring theme in U.S. water history, it is an over-reliance on large engineering fixes that take water from one ecosystem to solve a water problem in another, unintentionally but inevitably creating a more severe water problem for the next generation. In Blue Revolution, I tell the stories of the Delta of Northern California and the Everglades of Florida, two of the most water-abundant ecosystems on one of the most water-abundant continents. Today, the Delta and the Glades are both dying of thirst, and the people who rely on them suffering this human-made scarcity. So, gosh, you heard it said that I was an optimist. It doesn't seem like it at this moment. So the last pressure point I want to mention before you hear from the optimist involves energy. It takes a lot of water to produce energy and a lot of energy to produce water. And I've written a lot about this desalination plant and other energy projects. Over the past 10 years, water scarcity worries have held up or halted construction of new power plants in every single region of the country, even those regions we once thought of as abundant regions. So nationwide, between 10% and 20% of energy supplies pump, treat, and heat fresh water and move it around. That is higher than the amount of electricity we spend powering our computers and the internet. So that means, of course, that the best way to save energy is to save water and vice versa. But weirdly, water is really being left out, I think, of the debates over alternative energy in our country. And I would again blame that illusion of water abundance. Most parts of the United States still believe in this idea of abundant water for every sort of crop and every type of energy plant. That's no longer the case, if it ever was. So to me, these situations and others like them across the country make clear that the traditional solutions, and especially water management, government regulation, the courts, and costly technical fixes, none of those things are enough on their own to save our fresh water for future generations and ecosystems. All of those answers have a place. But one solution to me stands out above all of those others. It is the cheapest, it is the easiest. It fulfills our obligation to the future, and that is this idea of a water ethic for America and the embracing of a water ethic. So in 2009 and 2010, I took a year off my day job to travel around the country and the world to try to find out what this ethic might look like. Various academics and human rights activists have sounded this call. The Global Water Policy Project Sandra Pastel defines a water ethic as making protection of freshwater ecosystems a central goal in all that we do. The writer and ethicist Kathleen Dean Moore makes the moral argument that taking whatever we need from the world to support our comfortable lives while leaving unreliable freshwater supplies for the future is not worthy of us as moral beings. But the voice that resonated most with me was that of Aldo Leopold, whose call for a land ethic 60 years ago in Sand County Almanac helped inspire modern conservation. How many people have read Sand County Almanac in this audience? That's great. And I always ask, and it tends to be people of a certain age, my age and older, and it doesn't tend to be the college students in the audience. So I would encourage the college students. I am quite sure that the University of Arkansas Libraries has many copies of this book. So the thing I like about Leopold and the Sand County Almanac as a model for a water ethic is that, you know, it's not just this intangible, squishy idea. The types of things that Leopold wrote about agriculture and soil were all things that our culture ended up adopting over the rest of the century that would help us avoid disasters such as the Dust Bowl. And we really did embrace that land ethic. When the nice thing about going back and reading a Sand County Almanac to me is seeing how much of it is the way we live now, and that is absolutely possible with water as well. So anyway, Leopold was in Wisconsin, and I decided to start my search for a water ethic at his tiny shack near the Wisconsin River, where he thought through many of these grand ideas about people and land. Trained as a forester and founder of the field of wildlife ecology, he was intensely interested in figuring out that connection and helping people see their connection to the natural world. He believed the answer was an extension of the social conscience from people to land. So in other words, you wouldn't treat the land in the way you wouldn't treat your fellow human being. He believed, so I'm going to show you, there's his shack. So I have to admit I was surprised by what I found in Leopold's hallowed corner of Wisconsin. The shack and the prairie that his family restored are preserved in quiet posterity by the Aldo Leopold Foundation. Housed nearby in a showcase carbon-neutral building, visitors can tour the building and walk through the pine forest and prairie and all along the banks of the Wisconsin River. Visitors can do this, but not many do. And that's because exactly 10 miles from Leopold's shack lies the Wisconsin Dells, a tourist strip that is home to the largest concentration of water parks on the planet, including 20 indoor water parks and the biggest outdoor water park in the world, Noah's Ark. So Wisconsin Dells is, and by the way, I went to Noah's Ark and I went on every water slide there except the Black Anaconda. I try not to be preachy in my books. I like to wiggle my toes in a little bit of grass and go on water slides, but still have this conversation. So the Wisconsin Dells are so named for these incredible sandstone bluffs that drew nature-loving tourists to the area in the 19th century. But today, so many water slides have been erected in the town. They block every single easy view of the natural wonders that drew people here to begin with. So I thought the Wisconsin Dells perfectly captured America's water schizophrenia. We flock to water parks, yet we take their main ingredient for granted. Our appreciation for rivers has really increased over the past 2 decades as we do, river revitalizations in downtowns like you've done here, and as more families take paddling vacations. But this is a blithe and superficial love. We see a reflection of apparent abundance that will always meet our needs with plenty left over for show. But most people don't understand what's underneath. where water comes from, what's in it, who's in charge of it, and where it goes after we use it. So this is where the water ethic comes in. Aldo Leopold defined the land ethic as a community instinct in the making. I love that term. That would build an ecological consciousness among everyone who uses land. It turns out he had a direct impact on the water ethic, too, as father to his son, Luna Leopold. The whole Leopold family, they all became scientists, a really amazing family. Luna Leopold grows up to be the father of modern hydrology. He was chief hydrologist for the U.S. Geological Survey, and he ended up at Berkeley. And he built upon his father's ideas to call for an ethos for water. And his first wish was for a reverence, what he called a reverence for rivers. So that's that personal connection I just described. An understanding by ordinary people that, you know, a demystification of water and an appreciation for water. But that wouldn't be enough. He also tried to help people understand that technology could not fix all of our water problems, and that indefinite expansion of water supply was not possible. With nature's lessons in mind, he wanted to find the steady state, the balance point at which our water use today would not jeopardize fresh, clean water for our children and ecosystems tomorrow. So he articulated this water ethic as a set of guiding beliefs for government, large water users, and citizens, and the shared nature of this ethic is key, the idea that we will work together as a society on this issue. We know that agriculture and energy each drink up about 40% of the U.S. water pie, and so the ethic is much bigger than asking citizens not to plant grass or water lawns. This is really a new way of living with water in every sector of the economy. The question, of course, is how to make that transition. So I found the countries that have a tangible national water ethic tended to be those historically defined by drought, such as Australia, or by flood, such as the Netherlands, or that had lived under a water threat in some way, which was the case in Singapore. They have in common national and state political leadership that is ultra-focused on water. The Dutch are particularly inspiring for our divided times because they've shown how people with different points of view, different financial interests, and different political stripes can come together on water. For 1,000 years, the Dutch evolved a system called poldering, where all sectors of the community build consensus on water, which is both the most important asset and the biggest threat in this country, which is very, very similar to our situation. President Clinton was highly interested in the Dutch polder method of compromise, which is also called the Dutch way or the third way. He was interested in it as an economic model, and many moderates today hold it up as a political model for the United States. And if you're interested in this, you can Google the third way, and there's a group that's devoted to this as a way to forge compromise in the country during these acrimonious times. The reason it worked so well for water in the Netherlands was because if the Dutch didn't find ways to compromise on water, they would have drowned, of course. Most recently, the polder method has led to a national program called Room for the River that has torn down dikes, bought out farmland, and restored floodplain, applying the lessons of ecological restoration to climate change. This is a big step in a country whose history has been defined by stronger and stronger dikes. Australia is another country that now sees water as a matter of national urgency. 15 years ago, Australia entered a drying period that seemed much more severe than normal drought cycles. The first sign that something was different was that water levels in dams across the continent dropped below 35% capacity, which had been, even in their incredible drought history, that had been unheard of in recorded history. It turns out that Australia was feeling the water supply impacts of climate change earlier than the rest of us. Most of what you read about Australia's response to what they call the Big Dry involves desalination plants on the coast and water markets, agricultural water markets in the Murray-Darling Basin. But another really important part of the story is a great urgency to keep as much water as possible in natural systems, restoring wetlands, managing forests for water supply, and returning water to nature as a water supply strategy. Most dramatically, fully 1/2 of Australia's new water is coming from conservation efficiency thanks to a revolution of small technologies. So small as in micro irrigation for farming and waterless everything. Waterless urinals, waterless car washes, even waterless walks in the Chinese restaurants across Australia. Someone figured out that the Chinese restaurants were using way more water than anyone else, and they figured out that it was the steam process for the walk. So some ingenious person just created a waterless walk, and this is what happens. This is how a water ethic spreads. People figure these things out. So heeding the lessons of flood in the Netherlands and drought in Australia, what should be America's response to climate change? Is it taking more water out of our rivers, or will a new water ethic focus on the health of rivers so that they and we can withstand the floods and droughts that will become more frequent? Here in the United States, San Antonio is a good case study as a very wasteful city that made a turnaround on water. 20 years ago, San Antonio was in a similar case as Atlanta was, where a federal judge had come in and said, you absolutely cannot have any more of the Edwards Aquifer. It was an endangered species case. And I interviewed some of the city leaders from that time, and they told me it felt like Armageddon. They said there is no way we can live with less water from the Edwards Aquifer. And that's what you hear from people. We can't live with less. And that just did not turn out to be true here. That judge's decision ended up being impetus for real change. Industrial water users made particularly sweeping changes, largely thanks to this massive commercial rebate program that was funded by the city. I met building supervisors all over San Antonio who had slashed water use by millions of gallons a year with changes as simple as recycling their air conditioning condensate. So, and also the water that we now use for large industrial air conditioning cooling towers, that right now is potable water. There's absolutely no reason that it needs to be potable. That can be recycled, and it's just one of many ingenious ways of using much less water in all industries. I went to a Frito-Lay potato chip plant that saved 43 million gallons a year and $138,000 annually on its water bill. So this is the nice thing about the water ethic, is that it's very appealing to industry, because if we actually did some of these things, we would really save a lot of money. I was just hearing about the enormous utility and water savings in this building after they converted it to a green building, and they I think they recouped their cost in, was it 4 years? 4 years or 5 years. So anyway, the nice thing in San Antonio is to see how this spread across the community. A local granite company figured out a way to recycle water used in its wet saw, and then the other stone cutters in the city followed. A dentist realized that his old dental vac machine wasted an inordinate amount of water compared with newer models the utility would pay for, and so it switched, business by business across the city. And 20 years later, San Antonio has managed to cut its per capita water use in half. And that's not a difficult number to get to at all. That's also the number that has been seen in Australia. So the other thing that was really interesting about San Antonio, and I've also found this in Atlanta and some other parts of the country, churches got very involved in this issue in helping create a new ethic for water. Many Christian congregations in Atlanta, I write about this, have gotten involved in the water issue. And in several parts of the country, I've met nuns who had spent many years working on water in the third world, where there's a real crisis and people are dying for lack of fresh water, but now they see that they can also help make a difference in their own communities. So the water ethic requires this sort of democratization. It essentially says that water managers, water lawyers, large water users, even environmentalists, all those people are no longer enough. Just like the early 70s, water needs the rest of us now. Democratization also means more diversity in water professions. Here's my most subtle slide of the night. Water people here in the United States, water people all over the world really fret about the lack of women in third world water decisions. But the U.S. engineering workforce still has the greatest underrepresentation of women in any profession. The National Science Foundation reports that only 11.5% of working engineers are women. The U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics reports that the utility workforces look even less diverse. Water utility workforces are 90% male. So this is just another issue to talk about, and another way to democratize water, not only in the third world, but also in the United States. So the conservation progress I've talked about is just a drop in this real wave of transformation we're going to see across the country to help the nation live more ethically with water. We've now seen new subdivisions and even new schools built with little or no imported water. This is the Versailles School, one of 2 net zero water projects built last year in Seattle, and that's another one you could Google if you're interested in the idea of how a building could create more potable water than it uses. You want to Google the idea of net zero water. Many are also watching with great interest as Philadelphia goes forward with an all-green stormwater plan. And I know Arkansas is one of the places where we're very, very worried about our aging water infrastructure. And you hear today, I heard the word trillion, that now we need $1 trillion to fix our aging water infrastructure nationally. I don't believe those large numbers that you hear from the engineering societies. We would need to spend $1 trillion if we rebuilt our systems, remade our systems in the exact same way. That's not what we're going to do. We're going to remake them in new ways and live really differently. So this is just one example. To halt sewage spills and comply with the Clean Water Act, Philadelphia was looking at a $10 billion price tag for a massive sewage tunnel under the Delaware River. Instead, Philadelphia will spend $1.6 billion to restore streams, remake everything from parking lots to basketball courts with pervious pavement, and plant miles of vegetation atop rooftops and along city blocks. And these solutions, if you think of the asphalt that has been laid down over the United States, if you thought about every person taking out a driveway or converting all their concrete to pervious so that water could flow back into the aquifer instead of running off into huge storm drains where we then need to spend a lot of money to treat that water, and it becomes non-point source pollution. You can see what a big difference this would make. So if it's hard for you to imagine a day when we might build net zero water buildings around the nation or plant trees en masse rather than expanding stormwater drains and sewage pipes, I want to take you back to a time not so very long ago. Does anyone here watch the show Mad Men? This is a family. This is set in the 1950s, and it's the Don Draper family, this really handsome advertising executive and his lovely family, and they're having a picnic. It's all, when you watch it, it's so 1950s, everything about it. And they're having a lovely picnic at a park, and when they get up first, Don Draper says it's time to go, and he takes his beer can and chucks it into the woods. And then his lovely wife stands up to clean up the picnic, and she shakes out the checkered blanket, and all their litter goes all over the grass, and they just leave it there and pack up the car and go on. So I'm sorry my video clip didn't work. Younger members of the audience may not remember the time when people regularly left their picnic detritus at parks and flung their fast food bags out car windows while driving down the highway at top speeds, but mid-century, this is how many American families lived. Research on American littering behavior shows that we're absolutely capable of significant ethical change in just one generation. In 1969, half of all Americans admitted to littering in surveys, which means that far more than that actually did. By 2009, it was 15%. Drivers included inspired political leadership, private industry buy-in, successful educational campaigns, and government fines and regulations. But littering studies show that what changed the culture more than any other factor was a community-wide judgment about cleanliness, in other words, an ethic. As just once citizens had embraced this ethic, they pressured industry. As just one example, beverage companies finally eliminated the pull-off cans, the pull-off tabs on cans that used to be such a littering problem. So the point is that once citizens become aware of how water is used, of what industries use water, of unsustainable water uses, they will get involved. They can and do influence industry, and they can and do get involved in federal and state policy. And we really saw that last year over the debate over elimination of subsidies for corn ethanol. Usually, people don't pay very much attention to things like farm subsidies and these debates, and people really got involved in that issue. So these things can change. So when I was, as I was finishing Blue Revolution, I hesitated defining a water ethic for our country. I know each community will build its own water ethic based on its unique water resources and cultures. It will look different in each place in the same way our farmers markets look different depending on local climate and local crops. But I did sketch out 5 common goals with the caveat that they are fluid, as Aldo Leopold said, to evolve in the minds of the thinking community. And of course, you are the thinking community. So mine were: we value water, from appreciating local streams to being willing to pay an appropriate price for water, which is very important. We work together to use less and less, rather than fighting each other in court all the time to grab more and more. We try to keep water local to avoid the financial, ecological, and energy costs of long-distance transfers. We avoid the 2 big mistakes of our water history: over-tapping natural supplies and over-relying on the costliest fixes that bring unintended consequences to future generations. And finally, we leave as much as prudently possible in nature, aquifers, wetlands, and rivers, so that our children and grandchildren, with benefit of time and evolving knowledge, can make their own decisions about water. Some of these issues, like your Grand Prairie project, are socially and politically very painful. But I want to end with the idea that ultimately, water unites. When George DeForest Brush painted his Indian and the Lily in 1887, he warmed Americans to a subject that usually left them cold by putting his native at the water's edge with a water lily. Likewise, water will be the issue around which the shouting match over climate change will finally become a conversation. This is because the initial impacts of our changing climate all involve water, from changing rainfall patterns to more extreme flooding to more severe droughts. And these are all issues that people want to talk about. You can talk to people about rain or about their favorite fishing hole, even if you aren't able to talk to them about climate change. So you've heard how water brought the Dutch together to forge their unique Polder method of compromise. Geopolitical scholars analyzing transnational water interactions over human history have found, contrary to conventional wisdom, that water more often has led to peace than to fighting. Literally a chemical bond, water is, more than anything, one of the most powerful bonds among people. Thank you so much for having me at the Clinton School, and I'd be happy to answer your questions. Thanks.
Thank you. We have time for questions. If you'll raise your hand, then we'll get the microphone to you.
Thank you so much for being here. My name is Robert, and I'm a lifelong resident of Little Rock. And I think this is a very timely thing you're discussing, because we have a serious threat to our water here in Pulaski County. It's not, it is, I'm sorry. We have an artificial lake called Lake Maumelle that we get most of our water from. You're probably drinking from it right now.
Yeah.
And for the last decade, a corporation named Deltic Timber, which owns 12,000 acres on the land that flows into the lake, has been trying to build a city there. And they've recently, the most recent plan is to build 39,000 structures on this. And that will basically ruin drinking water supply. And I have found it very difficult to raise awareness about this and to get people to understand exactly, you know, what is at stake here.
Mm-hmm.
The utility talks about, I'm sorry. Anyway, I just wonder if you had any general advice for raising awareness about it.
So is the land is owned by a private developer and they have rights to develop the property? The land is privately owned and they have rights to develop the property. Yes, yes. Well, I mean, I don't know about the specifics of this project, but I would say that the best way to protect water resources, and this has been the case in the United States and in some of the stories I told you about the Netherlands, is when communities and governments and people are able to come together and put land in conservation easements or buy it outright. And you know, this compromise that we're talking about, it requires that the owner be well compensated for their loss. So it would take money to develop that. I mean, it would take money to conserve that property, I would think. And that's That's usually the only foolproof way to make sure that nothing happens there in the future, although there are conservation easements and other options. And hopefully in the end, if it ever does get developed, it would be developed in a way that is, as sustainable as possible. So I'm sorry I can't offer specifics about that case, but I really think that, keeping land in public ownership, if we can fairly compensate property owners, is really sort of the most important goal for some of these issues.
Yes, we have a question right here on the back row.
Here in Arkansas, we're using the system of wetland credits and stream credits to hopefully help us on the conservation side. Have you found that to be effective in any parts of the country that are suffering? Oh, no.
No, I'm sorry. I actually, I once wrote a big story about private wetlands mitigation banks, and I roamed all over the place with a scientist who helped analyze some of these banks. And I have to say, this has been a while. I think this has been about 8 years ago that I did that story. So it may be different here, and it may really depend. But the problem with many of the banks is that they're not doing a good job of recreating wetlands. That's very hard to do. It takes a lot of money to do that, and these are profit enterprises. So in the bit of experience I had, they weren't high quality. And then also, will the regulators have the time and the money to keep going back and checking like they're supposed to see if these things, one, to see if they get built, and two, to see if they're working and still working 5 years later, 10 years later. So I think, it's a matter of keeping an eye on them, and it'll be interesting to see what happens. I'm sorry I can't give you better news about the private wetlands banks that I know about.
All right, so let's see, we got right back here. Yes, sir, you right here. Yeah, and they're going to get you the microphone.
Fracking for natural gas is done in the Fayetteville shale region of this state, like many parts of the country.
Yes.
Has your research included any of the effects of fracking on groundwater?
I don't write about fracking in Blue Revolution. Some of these things were just starting to happen as I was finishing the book. But all I know about it is what probably the same things you read, that the worries are contamination of groundwater by the chemicals that are used for fracking. Sedimentation from the land disturbance of fracking is a very big issue for freshwater supply, and quantity of water is also an issue for fracking. And so this is another place where water and energy are really coming together. And maybe the good thing about fracking is that it's calling attention to this nexus of water and energy that really was ignored by the larger green movement. And I think that's really important. Because of the fracking concerns, we're having a conversation about that in the country where we hadn't been before.
Thank you for that very wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
As a physician, I would be remiss if I didn't say that the World Health Organization says that the #1 health hazard worldwide is clean water.
Yes.
And that's another part that's so important for
Yes.
this issue. I always wonder when we have these floods, why can't we drill at flood stage or just below flood stage, drill down into the aquifer so that we could put that extra water that instead of going to the ocean, couldn't it go down into the aquifer and refresh or refill?
Yes, there are examples of aquifers being replenished, and I think that's very promising. The idea that aquifers are replenished, and they can be replenished with floodwater, and they can be replenished with the water we've used. So that certainly has potential and happens in some parts of our country and elsewhere in the world. But I should address your comment about clean water, because that's so important. And I do write about water quantity, or I've tended to, but I think it's important to mention clean water and to say this is the 40th anniversary of the Clean Water Act. And I know that more than half of the U.S. water bodies that have been assessed are not meeting some standard or another of the Clean Water Act. And the problem is that the Clean Water Act dealt with point source pollution, and we're not dealing with non-point source. So that'll be, and that's all part of this ethic, that we are going to now deal with non-point source pollution. Part of that is a new way of living in our communities. You know, I told you about Philadelphia's green stormwater plan. We can live differently. We can, you know, capture rainfall in our little, if every one of us changed our own little house lot, that would make an enormous amount of difference with this stormwater issue. And agriculture is another big part of the non-point source pollution. So that too is another thing that we will deal with. We're sort of reassessing the Clean Water Act. I heard somebody say it's like having a midlife crisis. We've been with it for 40 years, and now it's time to reassess and find out how we can you know, live better in the next 40 years. And I think we're doing that. I think we will do that.
You mentioned Atlanta frequently.
Yes.
I went to school at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville, and so quite often, even just last week,
Yeah.
there was discussion yet again of diversion of the Tennessee River at
Yeah.
Chattanooga. There's even been discussion of whether or not the state line of Tennessee is
Right.
even where it's supposed to be.
Right.
So my concern is that there's going to be something like, you know, we stick a carrot out here for you, like Georgia will help fund high-speed rail through Tennessee to Atlanta in exchange for the river. And I honestly believe that that's something that is inevitable, and you can go and find writings about stuff like that. So something that's so big like that, how do you respond to
that?
it?
So you're from Tennessee and you think that? That's interesting, because viewing it as an outsider, I would think that Tennessee is going to say, no damn way. I don't think that will ever happen. And it's just like talking to people in the Great Lakes about whether the Great Lakes will ever be diverted. When you talk to people there, and they're so afraid of that, I think it would be one thing if there were a humanitarian crisis and people were dying and needed water. I think that could be a time when we see rivers or the Great Lakes truly diverted elsewhere in the United States. But to let a neighboring political rival take water, or for the Great Lakes to allow their water to be moved to the southwest to quench golf courses in Las Vegas, no, I don't think it'll ever happen.
Well, let's give Cynthia a round of applause here. And you have the opportunity to have her sign Blue Revolution. This is a very important topic, and as you've heard from people in Arkansas, one that's front and center here. So thank you very much for being with us. Katia, great job on the introduction.
Yes.
Thank you all very much. Have a safe trip home. Buy this book.
Thanks for having me.